Good evening, children, and welcome to a very special episode of Count Clockwork. Okay, kids, hang on. I don't think this is going to work too well. Give me 1 second. Wait, that's not right. I think the hat's on the fritz again. Hold on. I hate it when this happens. There we go. Okay. All right. Yep. That switch is busted. I'll fix that later, kids. Good evening, and welcome to a special edition of Uncle Clockwork. Tonight we're going to be talking about horror, the genre of horror, and specifically how to introduce someone to the genre of horror. Now, I'm speaking specifically of a younger person, someone who's generally in their preteens or younger teens. That's about the time that it's, in my opinion, generally appropriate to introduce someone. Up until that point, you've basically got to what you call a spooky child. And they are impressionable, and you don't want to hit them too hard with something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre right out of the box. You know, you could end up scarring them for life. So, you've identified yourself a spooky child. Maybe they like, you know, Scooby-Doo or Addams Family. You know, they love Halloween. They like Christmas, but they love Halloween. You know, those children are the ones that are going to be the most receptive to the genre of horror. So, in your old Uncle Clockwork's opinion, the best way to introduce them is start at the beginning. And why should you listen to Uncle Clockwork? Well, honestly, don't know. Been around a while in the horror game. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with your Auntie Cobweb. She likes horror too. We go to horror conventions. A lot. Costs an arm and a leg. Well, we get to meet people like Tom Savini and Kane Hodder. You know, Jeffrey Combs. You know, Julian Sands, John Franklin, lots of people. So, we know a thing or two about horror. And in my opinion, like I said, the best way to introduce someone is to start at the beginning. Now, if you got yourself a spooky kid, they've probably already read the Grimm's fairy tales, or the original ones. Those can get pretty graphic. They're cautionary tales. Originally, you know, tales told around the campfire or the hearth fire, meant to scare children into correct behavior, or to prevent them from doing something incorrect, like wandering off with a stranger. If you have a spooky child, they might have already been reading some horror comics, you know, good old House of Mystery from back in the day, or some of the spookier comics that you might get today. But really, if they're of age, I would suggest starting them off with this. Stephen King's Danse Macabre. Now this is Stephen King's basically perspective on the history of horror. You know, it's a just small read. But really, there have been a few people who have attempted to do this kind of thing before and since. Honestly, Stephen King, he knocks it out of the park. You know, from his perspective, the history of horror from beginning to up until, you know, when this was written, honestly, this is probably the best thing that you can give a person of that age to read. Just to get them familiar with the genre itself. And, you know, what to expect, who the heavy hitters are, you know, how it all began, and how it ended up going through the 20th century. Because that's primarily where we get our biggest influences in horror. At least for the modern age. Now, start them off at the beginning, literary. I would start them off with Edgar Allan Poe. Mask of the Red Death. Telltale Heart. Cask of Amontillado. Jeez, when I read Cask of Amontillado at age 13, man, it stuck with me. I mean, just the concept of someone hating someone so much they would trick them into a place and then wall them up and just leave them there. You know, that doesn't require a lot of graphic, you know, blood and gore or anything. It's just that mental instability that is just in the world. You know, you could meet someone like that. That could happen. That did happen. So, you know, start him out with Edgar Allan Poe. He gets pretty creepy, and that, in my opinion, is basically where the modern age of horror starts to begin. Bring him up to, you know, the early 20th centuries with H.P. Lovecraft. You know, of course, your old Uncle Clockwork loves H.P. Lovecraft. Shadow over Innsmouth, Call of Cthulhu, Dagon, any of the short stories, or even some of his poems, like, you know, Nyarlathotep. Really, these things just, you know, jar the imagination and really starts to spur them into that horror of the unknown, otherworldly horror, you know, extra-dimensional horror or ancient horror. These concepts that aren't usually, you know, seen in today's world. At least, not as much as I would like to see them. Film-wise, I would say you would start them off at the beginning again with the 1920s. Start them off with the silent films. Nosferatu, specifically. Nosferatu is probably one of the best vampire movies ever done. F.M. Murnau was the director. He wanted to do Dracula, but he unfortunately couldn't secure the rights from the estate of Bram Stoker. So he forged ahead, changed a few names. Instead of calling him Dracula, called him Count Orlok, and ended up basically making Dracula. But the way he did it was just so revolutionary. It honestly just spurred forth the early days of horror in film. Right after that, you get Lon Chaney Sr. and his performance as the Phantom of the Opera. You know, the old Victor Hugo tale. When I saw that, that was just brilliant. I loved Phantom of the Opera. That's one of the best silent films I've ever seen personally. Both that and Nosferatu. Again, start them off at the beginning. Now, when you get to the 30s, that's when the Universal movie monsters start to take off. And really, you can show it all to them. I would. But if you just want to stick to a couple of films per decade, so you don't overwhelm them and then let them go back, that's probably how I would do it. 2 from the 20s, 2 from the 30s, 2 from the 40s, 2 from the 50s, just, you know, go like that for a little bit. Let them get a feel of how horror evolved through the decades of the 20th century. I'd say just do a double feature of Frankenstein. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Really brilliant performances by all the actors. The guy who plays Ernest Thesiger, I think his name is, the guy who plays Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein, brilliant performance. Love that character. And really that also, I mean, the original tale from Mary Shelley is pretty accurately adapted when you watch both of those together. So you get that again, that classical horror, you know, being brought forward into the 20th century. So from there, 30s, I go into the 40s. Really, not much horror in the 40s because World War II occupied a lot of time, and war is horror enough. Really, the only thing that I recommend in the 40s would be 1941, The Wolfman. Lon Chaney Jr., taking over for his father in the horror business, gives a wonderful performance. Again, we get to see some of the older performers like Bela Lugosi. He makes a reappearance. Again, a good film as you see the bringing forth of horror from one decade into the other. Different film techniques, different writing styles, different directing styles. Again, better makeup. You see the progression. It looks great. But again, that's 1941. The rest of the 40s, you're occupied pretty much by war. And there's not that much going on in the 40s. So, but once you get to about the mid-50s, things start to pick up again. So in the 50s, 1954, again, Universal movie monster, Creature from the Black Lagoon. All right? Great film. Honestly, it's almost a little Lovecraftian because, it involves people venturing forth into the unknown of our world and finding something very ancient that has lived for a very long time, confronting that. So, very Lovecraftian, but again, brought up to speed for a modern era, 1954. From there going on into the 60s, I would say it gets a little bit more, you start to get into a little bit more of the psychological horror with Carnival of Souls. I would definitely recommend Carnival of Souls. Candice Hillinghast. The character's Mary in Carnival of Souls. Again, great performance. More of a psychological horror at that point. I guess I should take a time to say that at this point you start getting a lot of really good international horror showing up in the mid to late 50s and early 60s. Toho Studios starts up in 1954 with Gojira, Godzilla. Followed up by some big ones like Rodan and Mothra. Those were two of my favorites. But you get the Toho Studios and the kaiju films starting up. In the late 50s, 1958, you start seeing the Hammer horror show up. And you got to throw them at least one or two Hammer horrors in there. Honestly, right around here, you got to start throwing them a little bit more, I think, than just two films. Christopher Lee as Dracula. You got to at least appreciate Christopher Lee as Dracula. Peter Cushing as Abraham von Helsing. These films start showing up. So you get the good British horror. In addition to the Japanese horror showing up. Even some good Spanish horror. Oh God, what was that guy's name? It was like Rafael Belladon did Malediction de la Llorona. I'm sure I'm screwing that up. It's Curse of the Crying Woman. I want to say that was like 1961 or 62, 60s, early 60s. Curse of the Crying Woman. You get some good, like, Spanish-influenced horror. Mexican, Spanish. I think it's Mexican. Really good. They did a remake that wasn't so good. I think it was in 98 or more recent. But honestly, see the original one. Like I said, right around there you start getting some good international stuff. Some good Mexican, Spanish, Hispanic horror. You start getting some good Japanese, the kaiju films. The British Hammer horror starts up. And if you still want to stick to American, 68, somewhere around there, you got George Romero and Night of the Living Dead. There you go. The first big zombie film. About the same time, you also get Rosemary's Baby. Again, that religious influenced horror. Okay, yeah, we all know Roman Polanski is a total chode, but Mia Farrow does a great performance. Don't discredit her work just because Polanski's a dick, in my opinion. But, Rosemary's Baby does stand on its own and, should be considered. So by that time, you've got this young person fairly well introduced to horror. And you can hit them with the big one, The Exorcist. Now, if they can handle The Exorcist, especially if they were like raised Catholic, if they can handle that, then they're ready for the 80s. Now, Uncle Clockwork is just going to leave it right there, okay? Because I could do at least 2 or 3 more episodes on the 80s, alone. The 80s is the golden era of horror, in my opinion. You start off a couple of little dribbles here in the 70s, especially when John Carpenter comes on the scene, and then it just explodes. So we'll take another episode and talk about 80s horror and all the wonder that it is. But for right now, I think that's a good way to get your young person, your spooky child, your spooky teen, whatever, introduced properly into the world of horror. Again, start them at the beginning. Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft. Like I said, Stephen King, Dance Macabre. That'll be their reading material. And then from the film world, 1920s on up. And that's Uncle Clockwork, clocking out. We'll see you next time.